Hi everyone, welcome to week 7. This is the first of 6 videos this week because there are more videos than usual. I'm going to try to keep these shorter but also at the same time give you enough information and enough questions to spur some thought about what we're doing in this final essay and how we analyze poetry and what we need to do to prepare for all these things. So this first video will be probably the shortest. I'm going to introduce you to a document that I have put in the Canvas files under miscellaneous. It is called Practicing Critical Reading. It is a summary or a snapshot of the reading I assigned from Anteater's Guide to Writing and Rhetoric for the chapter under the same title, Practicing Critical Reading. Go and read the whole thing if you haven't done so. The examples that the chapter gives you will be helpful in just helping you think about how to approach creative text or even an essay with a critical reader's lens. Specifically, I'm going to break down some of the questions or categories it asks you to consider when you read critically, and then ultimately we're going to apply these questions to poetry. The chapter has examples of a play, I think, and an essay, an academic essay. We'll, of course, be applying it to poetry. So I put this document together there. Called Practicing Critical Reading. Again, it's posted in the Canvas files under miscellaneous section, and this is going to be a good resource for you as you continue to learn how to analyze a poem and ultimately do it for your final essay. So I started this document by pulling, 3 quotes from the text that are part of its introduction that I think are very useful and will give us even an understanding of how to apply these steps that I've laid out for us when we read a poem. So I'll read these quotes first and then just walk through the 5 steps that we're going to apply to poem reading for our practice analysis. So at the beginning of the chapter, the writer said, "You are looking to make judgments about the text, what it means, how it means, for whom it is intended, and why it was created." So these categories really are going to focus the different steps that we take here. What it means will apply to the story and the characters and the setting, and maybe even, well, maybe that's enough, but what the content is saying, maybe even what its message is, if that is very clearly stated. How it means is going to get us into an understanding of the style and the poetic techniques that the poem uses in order to create that meaning. For whom it is intended, we have to identify who the audience is and what the impact on that audience is. And then why it was created. Why it was created is going to be more about the purpose and the message, argument, value, whatever we are calling it. We have a few synonyms there. So from there, some practical advice. The writers of the chapter say, as a critical reader, it's our job to pay attention. Our brains like to slide over words, filling in what we think the words mean or should mean, rather than focusing on what they do mean. Now this is important for all reading that we do, but it's particularly important for poetry because we know that the story, the argument of the poem is represented in few words. Poems are short, they're condensed, they're compact, and so every word matters, and we don't want to gloss over words and just assume we know what they mean or assume they're not important because they are. And then lastly, the chapter explains that we need to be detectives of sorts, learning to use context and clues from both within the text and from its rhetorical situation to figure out what it's saying. So this idea of clues and detectives, for me, that's helpful just to think about in terms of looking for evidence. When we think of detectives, we say they look for evidence. So looking for evidence in the poem to suggest that the writer is trying to create a particular effect on the reader's emotions or the reader's thoughts. I don't want the connotation of detectives and clues to make you feel that poets and poems are meant to be tricky and elusive and that we have to figure them out like they're a puzzle. We heard Edward Hirsch earlier on in the quarter trying to get us around that connotation as well. But basically just think about it as evidence, looking for evidence, places in the poem, specific things the poet does or says that have a particular effect on the reader. It helps us figure out what the whole is going to say. And then one last one here. One way to understand a text is to pay attention to small pieces at a time and asking questions about what you see there. So that idea of detectives, clues, and evidence can be seen in paying attention to small pieces at a time, which is essentially what the definition of analysis is. It is a breaking apart of something that is whole into its smaller parts to see what those smaller parts say about the whole. So breaking something down to see how it works and then putting it back together again. So I'm applying the questions or the categories that the chapter on practicing critical reading explains to poems for us. And I put them in this 5-step format, 5 things or 5 steps you should take when you read a poem. And following these steps will help you get a really good understanding of what the poem you're reading and analyzing is about and how you can talk about it and ultimately prove the meaning you say it has is true. So this is for your reference. I'll walk through it here, but then you have it in Canvas to keep on your desk or by your side as you read any poem the rest of this quarter. So step 1 is going to be reading for the basics. So we've done this already to a certain degree, but you're going to continue to do it. Read the poem out loud. Record yourself reading it. Read it multiple times. Just read it out loud to hear it, to take pleasure in it, to notice some language that maybe you wouldn't notice if you were just reading it in your head. Part of the basics also is to mark words you do not understand and look them up. So if you don't understand some of the vocabulary, and I know a lot of you in your discussion on your history with poetry said that poetry has difficult vocabulary. You don't understand the words sometimes. So what do you do when you don't understand the words? You look them up and you write their definitions in the margins. 3, if you think you understand a word, but that word seems to be emphasized in the poem, look up the word to make sure you understand it correctly. Oftentimes in the English language, our vocabulary or our words have multiple meanings, multiple layers of meaning. So even if you think you understand a word, but it seems like it's important to the poem, look it up to see if it has some alternative meanings that you weren't familiar with. And write those in the margin of the poem, right on the paper. So that'll get the basics done. From there, step 2 will be reading the poem for the story. Just trying to figure out the story, who's speaking, what's happening. So the 5 questions here follow those categories. Question 1, who is speaking? What do you know about the speaker? What is the setting or the situation of the poem? So where is it happening? In what context is it taking place? What action, if any, is taking place? So what series of actions? Is there a plot? Is there a story? Is there cause and effect, reaction, so on and so forth? Is the poem in present or past tense, or maybe both? You want to be able to identify the time in which this poem is happening. And then maybe as you go stanza by stanza, what is the main idea, image, thought, or feeling of each stanza that you gather? So there's another layer of basics for you to consider. And a lot of those, the first 2 steps, deal with the what a text means. What do the words mean? What is the setting? What is some of the main ideas? Who is the speaker? A lot of those have to do with the what. The next 2 categories, the style and the poetic technique, go into more how a text means. So we're transitioning into that. Step 3 is about the style. It says, what is the tone of the poem? How can you tell? Can you identify any markers of style, such as the skills we practiced in the style portfolio? Is the writer using imperatives? Are they emphasizing metaphor? Do they have a particular syntax and variation of sentence structures that is interesting to you? Just identifying markers of style and maybe even writing them in the margin as well. Do you notice any specific rhetorical choices the writer has made? This might be similar to question 2, because as we know, all style choices and all argumentative choices have a rhetorical effect, meaning that they get the reader to respond in a particular way, and they are audience-focused choices that the writer has made. And then question 4, for all of the above, what emotional or logical effects do these create? We practiced that in the poems we read earlier in the quarter. So when Mary Oliver uses the metaphor of life as chicken soup, we said that there is an emotional effect, that she's asking the reader to embrace and or feel the comfort, warmth, pleasure, luxury that that image suggests. And so you can do that for these style skills. What emotional or logical effects do they create? We're going to deepen that understanding of style in the next category called the poetic technique. And this is going to identify more specifically what you're doing in the final essay. Can you identify all or some of the 5 poetic techniques in the poem? Which techniques seem emphasized the most? So is there a lot of metaphor? For instance, in the poem Harlem by Langston Hughes that we read earlier on in the quarter, there is all metaphor. The whole poem is metaphor, so it's being emphasized. So you're just noticing that imagery or metaphor is a technique that's being foregrounded. And then for all of the above, what emotional or logical effects do these create? Basically, that's taking the parts, one part of style or one part of technique or one image or one series of word choices and saying what the emotional effect is. So that goes back to this idea of breaking something down into its parts and paying attention to small pieces to see what it's saying. Last category, step 5, is to figure out the purpose, message, argument, or value. Ultimately, the class question says, how does a poet make meaning? So that question is forcing you to consider 2 things. What the actual meaning or message or purpose of the poem is, and then how, using the style skills and poetic technique, does the poet make that message, meaning, known? So the 2 questions here are how you finalize your understanding of the poem. What does the writer want the reader to understand, believe, and or feel by the end of the poem? And then ultimately, how does the writer build up to that goal? This last question points you back to poetic technique, points you back to style, and points you even back to story to put it all together. In the next video, we are going to, let's see. In the next video, we are going to apply these questions, this 5-step method, to Ernst Stadler's The Saying. And we're going to walk through it together, and then I'm going to ask you to do a discussion follow-up to practice this on your own. So that is it for now. Again, in Canvas Files, Miscellaneous folder, you will find this document. It's something to refer to for the rest of the quarter as you practice poetic analysis. All right, see you soon.